Can I tell you a story? Okay.
Sure.
Okay. It's a good story for the psychedelic experience, perhaps, at least as an analog. So in the story of Exodus, there's a number of circumstances under which Moses has an encounter with God. And they're very useful stories to understand because they point you to how that can make itself manifest in your own life. So the first real encounter that Moses has with God is in the story of the burning bush. And by this time, Moses is an adult. He's left his home. He's gone out and he's got married. He's apprenticed as a shepherd, which was a very, very hard job in those days because shepherds not only had to protect the weakest and serve them, but also keep the lions and the wolves at bay by themselves out in the wilderness. It was a very hard job. And Moses has mastered this. So he's grown up and he's adopted a role that's like a standard social role. You know, he's a husband, he's a shepherd, he's an adult. Okay, and so kudos to him. But then one day he's out in the wilderness by the holy mountain. I think it's Horeb in that story, but the holy mountain is always the place where heaven and earth touch. And so there are all sorts of transformation stories that occur in the biblical accounts at Mount Horeb or at Mount Sinai, where God and earth meet. And he's out near the holy mountain, and something attracts his attention. And he goes off the beaten path to investigate. Okay, so that's the first thing, that's the first bit of wisdom to derive from the story. You'll have your role, and you should have your role as a socialized adult, right? So you're kind of a type that way. You're maybe even a cookie cutter type, but you've adopted this mature social role. It doesn't make you a full individual, but it's better than being immature and staying in your father's tent, for example, which is what Abraham does until he's very old. So something attracts Moses' attention, and he goes off to investigate. Okay, so, and then he sees that it's a burning bush. And so what's a burning bush? Well, it's the tree of life, and life is often represented as a branching tree. And it's on fire because it's compelling, because fire is compelling, and fire is alive, and it's a symbol of life because everything that is alive burns. That's what metabolism is. And so a burning bush is like life itself intensified to the ultimate degree, and that's what attracts Moses' attention. And he gets closer and closer to it, which means he investigates more and more deeply. And as he investigates more deeply, he starts to understand that he's nearing the depths. He's on sacred ground. He takes off his shoes, and that's an indication of his willingness to transform in identity. And he continues to investigate, and then the voice of being itself speaks to him from the depths, and it tells him that it reveals itself to him as the ground of being itself, and it transforms him into the leader who invites his people away from slavery and who stands up against tyranny. And so that's the story of Moses' baptism. And so what does that mean for the ordinary person? Well, it means that you need to grow up and adopt a role. You need to mature. You need to become an adult. You need to be a good man in your time. But then you have to pay attention to see what attracts your attention, what calls to you, because there's an autonomy about that, right? You don't get to pick what interests you. It picks you, and you can respond to that call and investigate or reject it. Those are your options, and if you reject it, you stay in your box. But if you follow it, something will call to you, and then if you investigate that, that will transform you. And if you investigate it deeply enough, it'll transform you into the person who can stand up against tyranny and who can lead his people away from slavery. And that's how God is defined in that story. God is the thing that calls to you to take you out of your role, that will shape the manner in which your psyche transforms itself as a consequence of your diligent investigation into what calls to you. And so that's the God that's portrayed. That's one image of the God that's portrayed in the Old Testament.
Are you aware of some of the more recent work that's been done by scholars in Israel, where these guys have now come up with this hypothesis that the burning bush was actually, it was a DMT experience? And that the burning bush was most likely an acacia tree, that the acacia tree is apparently rich with DMT, and they think, the way you get a DMT experience is you smoke it, right? And that they had some method of achieving psychedelic states through this, and this is where Moses is encountering God.
Well, we have One of the
Have you read any of that stuff?
I know about the theorizing, and
Yeah.
it's certainly the case that people have been using psychedelic experiences for we don't know how long.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of years, no doubt. And they've had a profound cultural consequence. One of the things that a psychedelic experience does is amplify that sense of intrinsic interest, right? So it strips your perceptions of their inhibition by memory. That's a good way of thinking about it. So that you see what's there instead of your habits of perception. And so it's a way of amplifying, you could think of it as a way of amplifying what's represented in the biblical corpus as a calling. And the thing that's odd about the calling, well, you know, you can think about it this way. When you're laying out a podcast, when you're participating in a podcast, you're following a golden thread, right? You're following where your interest takes you and your curiosity takes you. And that's not something you can pre-plan, right? It's something that happens in the moment. So imagine that you're focused on your goal of having the most interesting conversation possible and communicating what's derived to the broadest number of people. So that's the overarching goal. Okay, now you focus on the moment and a spirit arises within you. That's a good way of thinking about it. That's the logos. A spirit arises within you that leads you on a pathway that's an investigation into the truth. That's part of that calling. The psychedelic chemicals, they heighten that. They heighten the manifestation of the underlying mystery. That's another way of thinking about it. They do that neurochemically. And so, now what's the association between that and religious revelation in the Bible? We don't know. We don't know.